about whether you can force someone to refer to you or refrain from referring to you in different ways. I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people, to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun, that's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience, when people use the wrong gender labels to them, they've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object, but using that pejorative label, we do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay, well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns. And that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? I mean, adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage of times when you use a pejorative adjective to describe someone, especially if you believe that they've misbehaved. It's like, if the person can insist upon their pronoun, why can't they insist upon their adjective? And that's another part of this problem with this multiplicative complexity that it isn't addressed properly within the law. With regards to respect, you said, well, human civilization progresses a lot better if we respect one another, and I actually don't believe that at all. I believe that human civilization progresses and maintains itself when we respect people who've earned respect. You don't just respect everybody randomly. Well, what the hell use is respect if you just respect people randomly? It's like inflating the currency, It's like the Simpsons episode where, Bart gets a trophy because it's every child gets a trophy day. All you do is inflate the currency. Respect is actually limited to that category of people who have earned respect in some manner. So whatever you're talking about with regards to, say, common decency between people, it's not respect. And the definitions actually matter. They matter a lot. And so I hear the respect argument all the time, but you also can't force me to respect you. You might be able to force me to act like I respect you, but you can't force me to respect you. It's just not possible. You could break me, I suppose, and then perhaps I would do it, although I can't see exactly how precisely. But so there's a number of, I get your point, and I'm not trying to denigrate it in any sense. There's a complex issue here, which is, to what degree do you allow individuals to govern the conversation that's had about them in their presence or otherwise? But I would just revert back to my original argument, which is that's a negotiation. It's either a negotiation. You got 3 states to negotiate with someone. You can be their slave, or you can be their tyrant. And I would pick negotiation, but as far as I'm concerned, the law right now, as it's currently instantiated, is a tyrant, and it makes people into its slave, and we're going to pay for that.
What's in a name? Potentially a great deal. University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson has a fight on his hands after objecting to proposed legislation that he says would violate his freedom of speech by forcing him to address transgendered people using the pronouns of their choosing.
Okay. Well, as you can can see the opponents of free speech are capable of making a lot of inarticulate noise. Free speech is the mechanism by which we keep our society functioning.
Okay, with indulgence of everybody else on the program, I'm going to start with Professor Peterson off the top here for a while because, as I suggested, you thought long and hard about this. You posted a few things up to YouTube because you had been thinking long and hard about it. 1.5 million hits later, Jordan, 1.5 million hits later, this has become a huge issue. So let's start there. Why did you post those views to YouTube in the first place? Well,
there's proximate and distal reasons. The proximate reasons was because I received some correspondence from clients of mine who had been, I would say, persecuted in a variety of ways by people who were politically correct. And they sent me some documentation about Bill C-16 and the associated policy statements on the Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I read and was not very happy about. And also because the University of Toronto decided to make anti-racism and anti-bias training, so-called anti-racism and anti-bias training, mandatory, which I regarded as an inappropriate incursion into the domain of political opinion by the university administration.
Have you taken that training yet?
No, and I don't have to yet. It's the HR department personnel that have to take it.
If they decide that you have to, will you?
No way.
You know me, I'm little dude dirty.
To take us right back to the beginning of a person's life. And I want you to tell us about a study done by Simon Baron-Cohen, Borat's cousin, right? Okay, Sasha's cousin, in which one-day-old infants are observed on how they react to objects and faces. What does the study tell us?
Well, boys don't react to faces as much as girls do, and they seem to be more attracted to movement. And according to Baron-Cohen, that's an example of testosterone, prenatal testosterone-induced differences in people versus thing processing, or he calls it actually empathizing versus sympathizing. And his body of research is quite powerful because he looks at prenatal testosterone levels in fetuses and then later, after they're born, correlates those levels with a variety of observable behaviors. One of them is eye gaze, but there are others. So for example, increased testosterone is associated with increased like for rough and tumble play. That's another one. So, and the effects are actually quite large. So the importance of the study is that it's very difficult to associate that particular effect with a socialization explanation. I wanted to make a comment quickly on the issue of whether or not gender differences and racial differences, for that matter, are politically legitimate domains of inquiry. First of all, I don't think there are politically illegitimate domains of scientific inquiry. There's just scientific inquiry. I mean, with racial differences, for example, it's the case that the causes of elevated blood pressure, for example, in black Americans versus white Americans are not the same. Black Americans tend to be more salt sensitive than white Americans. And that actually happens to be an important thing if you're a black American with high blood pressure. And there are other differences in disease propensity as well. So for example, Jewish people, especially the European Jews, have a tendency towards an increased propensity of certain kinds of neurological diseases. And so yeah, and you can't, there's no reason to ignore those. The question is, what do you do with the findings? And that's the moral issue. But part of the reason you want to get it right is because people take their guesses about gender differences, which are usually ideologically informed, and so they're global and not specified and usually not based on any data, and then they make political decisions that are predicated on them. And so in Scandinavia, for example, the presumption has always been that the reason that there are more female nurses than male nurses is because of socialization differences. And then the consequence of, you might say, so what? But the consequence of that is that there are continual movements by people who are obsessed with equality of outcome to ensure that that stops being the case. Okay. And you can think of that as a form of coercion.
Trudeau, in what he represents is, I think, the good side of it, what he's trying to do, they're trying to make a kinder, more progressive, more inclusive country. But along the way, what they're doing is they're promoting what you would call online social justice warrior values. And some of them are a little preposterous. You are one of the very few academics who have fought against some of these ideas that are not just being promoted, but are being enforced and written into law. And one of them is about gender pronouns. What we mean by gender pronouns is not just he and she, but a whole slew of invented gender pronouns that you're going to be compelled to use.
Yeah, you're already compelled to use, and likely in the States too, even though people don't know it yet. Certainly in New York, and the employment EEOC has already ruled on that with regards to businesses for the U.S. and
businesses, and I believe also landlords. I think so if your landlord chooses to misgender you, and not just misgender you, like if you're a transgender woman, you used to be a man, now you're a woman, and they call you a he. It's not just that. Like, you're compelled to use how many? What is the number of them now?
Well, there's no standard nomenclature for the non-gender or for the non-binary types. There's many invented words, and which of those you're supposed to use is dependent entirely on the subjective choice of the person that you're talking with.
Now, most people, I believe, out there listening are going, what the hell are they talking about right now? We're talking about as many as 70 plus invented gender pronouns like Z, XE, ZIR, HIR, a bunch of weird ones. And this is for people that don't necessarily think they're a he or a she. So they prefer these things. On top of that, you have animal kin. Which is
other kin. Including worm self, which was the one I found most amusing.
Worm self, fox
I guess that's for the low self-esteem otherkins.
This is people that truly believe that they are in the wrong body and that they should have been born some form of animal, and would like you to refer to them as this animal.
Or elf.
Or fairy. I've seen pixie.
Yeah.
Pixiekin.
I haven't seen Pixiekin. That's a good one.
But just get on Tumblr. You got to get on Tumblr.
Right.
I want to go talk to Peterson. Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. And I'm a historian of medicine. I can unpack that for you at great length if you want, but in the interest of time, I won't. So that's a very popular misconception. So essentially, when in my transgender studies classes, what we're doing is looking at actual research and identifying ways that current social issues related to trans people or things that are associated with trans, such as free speech arguments and claims, how that connects to the way that people are thinking, the way that research has been framed, the histories.
Give us some of the other pronouns that one would hear, typically.
I don't focus on pronouns because pronouns are actually part of a cisnormative culture. So what we do is learn about...
I'm going to stop you right there.
Yes, I was just about to explain.
Good.
So we don't start from a cisnormative perspective because that can't actually go very far.
What does cisnormative mean?
So I'm going to start us there. Cisnormative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that most people probably have, and definitely that our structures convey, that there is such a thing as male and female, that they connect to being a girl or a boy. Because that's sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. So anything that fits within a gender binary can work within cisnormativity.
Okay.
But cisnormativity is basically that actually the case, and scientists have been doing this for at least over 50 years.
Your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true, and yet our social systems haven't been able to find a way to address the level of complexity that people actually experience.
Can I step in, Steve?
Stand by for a second, because I want to let everybody else get in first,
and
then we'll get you in.
You either.
Let's go to British Columbia. Theron, I want you to help us understand, for our viewers who don't know you and don't know your work, is this to say you were born male but now are female?
Yes, I transitioned from male to female.
In which case, do I refer to you, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Mary, which is, do I refer to you as her or she now?
Yes, you do.
I do, okay. And how do you relate to the experiences that we have heard arise during this debate where gender identities and pronouns are up for grabs, if you like?
I'm very skeptical of the ideology surrounding gender identity. I don't believe there are 29 plus gender identities or genders. I believe there's male and female, and then there's somewhere in between, and most people fall along that. And just people who are in between does not constitute a new gender. There are two genders, period. And that is biologically a sound argument to make, just because the argument that was made earlier in the show is that, or it wasn't an argument, but a claim that there is no such thing as biological sex. Well, that's simply not true. It is true that there are multiple characteristics and there are multiple factors that go into determining sex, and that sex is not an on-off switch, that there is a spectrum to it, just like with most things in nature. Most things aren't an on-off switch, most things develop like on a spectrum. But for the most part, the vast majority of people fall either on the male side or on the female side. And I'm sure, I mean, I would hope that if I were a student of Dr. Peterson, that he would refer to me as she and wouldn't have a problem with that. But at the end of the day, you know, a personal pronoun preference still is a preference for what language other people use. And at the end of the day, I don't have ultimate control over what Dr. Peterson, what the language he chooses to use, or anybody else for that matters. That's up to them.
Have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways?
Let me find out. If she were a student of yours, what would you call her?
She.
You would. Okay. We've established that.
Well, I don't understand what the claim that there's no such thing as biological sex means. And I certainly think it's, let's call it an error, to suggest that there's some sort of scientific consensus about that. I mean, there's biological differences between males and females in animals and human beings at every level of analysis.
Okay, I'm jumping in here, because what about the notion he put forward at the end there, that if you do not refer to people with the pronoun that they prefer to be referred to, that is a form, according to the Human Rights Commission, of discrimination.
It's not just a form of discrimination, it's a form of hate speech. That's why I made the video. I said that we were in danger of placing the refusal to use certain kinds of language into the same category as Holocaust denial, and suggested that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, especially since there's plenty of debate to be had about gender issues in our society, which I also think are also in danger of becoming illegal, and quite rapidly. So it isn't clear to me how long we'll be able to have the talk that we're having right now.
Here are some.
Can I jump in there? Can I jump in there on?
Please.
The book? I think that's a common misconception about Bill C-16, that it's somehow going to make pronoun use into hate speech. If you actually look at the provisions, we're talking about very minor amendments to the criminal code. For
They're
example,
not minor.
section.
They put it into the hate speech category. They're not minor at all. That's a misstatement.
Agree with you on that point. I think
so.
there's
Don't
a lot
tell
of
me they're minor.
here.
That's not
There's
right.
a lot of opportunity.
So section.
Was it a transgender man that you were having a discussion with that was saying that there's no difference, no biological difference in the sexes?
Yeah, no biological difference. He said that the scientific consensus for the last I'm not sure. I don't believe so. He was a professor who taught transgender studies at the University of Toronto. And he said outright that there were no biological differences between men and women, and that was the scientific consensus. And he believed that he had the qualifications to say that because he was a historian of medicine, which hardly qualifies as a scientist. Not that you have to be a scientist to notice that there are biological differences between men and women. It was very bizarre for me at that point in the last few months, because I was under substantial pressure from the university to stop repeating my claim that I wouldn't use compelled pronouns to refer to people, because the university regarded that as against the university policies and also against the Ontario Human Rights Code, so also illegal. And as my employers, they're responsible for everything I say, whether or not there has been a complaint made, whether or not the consequence of my speech is intended or unintended, because that's built into the legislation. And believe me, that's coming your way, because this legislation spreads like mad. But on the one hand, I got 2 letters of warning from the university for refusing to use these compelled pronouns, which I regard as the ideological constructions of radical left-wingers. And this professor went on the agenda, this Ontario news show, and announced publicly that there were no biological differences between men and women. It was like, you'd think maybe the university would have had something to say about that, since they do, in fact, have a biology department. But, oh no, that went by without notice. That was perfectly fine. It's insane. It's
such an insane thing to say. If there's no biological difference, then why are they taking hormones?
Well, that's a good question. Why bother with the surgery and especially the hormones?
Yeah.
Because that's not, like, you could argue with surgery that's cosmetic, right?
Yeah, this person, whoever this professor was, is expert in transgender studies.
Nicholas Matt.
I'm pretty sure that used to be a woman, or she, they. You're not allowed to say that. If you say that, you're a bad person. If you say they. And they and them is the most reasonable of these these alternative pronouns, they and them. Like, you could say, if you know a guy and he doesn't know how to swim, they should probably stay out of the pool.
Right. Well,
you could say that. You could use that in a non-plural form.
Yes, and they is used to repair awkward sentences, basically. Yes. But it's never been used, despite the claims of the gender bender activists. It's never been used for the singular, and we shouldn't give up the distinction. We shouldn't give up the distinction between the plural and the singular.
No, it's ridiculous.
We actually need to know whether it's one person or more than one person.
The one woman who was trying to say, what is the difference between not using those words and using racial slurs and hate speech to describe these people, like the idea that that's a woman who's a professor who's expressing it in that way. What is the difference between not choosing to use made-up pronouns versus calling someone generally accepted racial slurs?
Yeah.
That they're trying to frame that as the same thing.
Well, and
it's so intellectually dishonest.
Well, the racial slurs are also legal. So what's happening is the law is already such that not using one of these made up pronouns is a crime, whereas using a racial epithet isn't.
Wow. That's crazy. So you could use the N-word.
No, it's legal too. Yes.
But you have to say zir.
Yeah.
You have to say Z. The real problem that you see with being forced into using these made-up pronouns.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my language. I'll take responsibility for what I say. I am not saying your words.
And being compelled to say your words by law.
Well, that takes it past the point of absurdity to the point of tyranny, in my estimation.
And I've seen some criticisms where people are saying, he's talking about this, but really he's grandstanding because no one's doing anything legally. But the potential exists.
Oh, that's such rubbish.
But that is one of the arguments.
Yes, they wouldn't have changed the damn criminal. They put it in the hate speech category and altered the criminal code. It's as simple as that. And then you could say, well, no, we didn't really mean it. It's like, oh, yeah, you did. You really meant it. 2 of the social justice warriors that have debated me in the last 2 months accused me directly of hate speech. All I had to do was poke them a tiny bit, and they came right out with it. And then the university's legal team reviewed everything I said carefully, believe me, and they decided that, it was not only illegal to not use these compelled pronouns, it was probably illegal to make a video saying that I wouldn't use them. Because otherwise, why would they write me a warning letter and tell me that I violated university policy on the Ontario Human Rights Act? You think they did that lightly?
Have they acted on this at all?
Well, they won't know. Well, they've acted in that they sent me 2 warning letters and told me to stop talking. And the idea that I was going to be teaching in January again, because I teach all my undergraduate courses from January to May, that was on the table. And I think the only reason that it hasn't happened, one of the reasons it hasn't happened, and I'm not attributing nothing but malevolence to the university administration, because obviously it's very complicated, and they did agree to host the debate, for example. But the idea that I wouldn't be teaching in January, and still might not be, is by no means. That was a perfectly plausible outcome. And had this not caused a firestorm, much of which has emerged in support of me, then I would say there was a 50-50 chance that I would have had my teaching privileges revoked. It's happened to other professors. So the idea that I'm making it like that this is a tempest in a teapot, it's like, yeah, okay, fine. Why'd you change the criminal code then? And why'd you put it under the hate speech laws? Exactly. So no, doesn't wash. And the fundamental proof of that is the university's response, because for sure their legal team crafted those letters. You know, it was like, recalcitrant employee, you're responsible for them. Okay, what do you do with a recalcitrant employee? You write them a letter telling them what they're doing wrong and asking them to stop. Then if they don't stop, you write them a second letter that's more strongly worded. Then if they don't stop, you write them a third letter, even more strongly worded. Then you take disciplinary action. That's like HR 101. That's how you do it.